The face of little Christopher Laverack made headlines around the world when he was abducted, assaulted and murdered in the case that shocked Hull over 40 years ago. This is the case of Christopher Laverack. Christopher had been born to his mother Pam and his father Mr. Laverack. Every other Friday, Christopher would go and stay at his older sister's house at 7 Harpham Grove. He always had a good time staying with the family, and despite a complicated home life, Christopher seemed to be happy. He enjoyed anything motorbikes and loved watching TV. He'd also recently joined the church choir. Christopher had attended St Andrew's Primary School in Kirkella and was well known in his previous home village of Leven. On the evening of Friday, March the 9th, 1984, he had kissed his mother Pam Crawley goodbye and gone to stay with his older half-sister in Harpham Grove, just off Preston Road in East Hull. She had no idea that this would be the last time she ever saw him alive. He arrived at his sister's home at 6:50 p.m, just in time to watch his favourite show, The Fall Guy. As normal on a weekend, Christopher's sister was driven to her job at the local pub. At the pub, Chris's mother and stepfather also stopped by for a drink to say hi to Pam. So at home, Kim's husband, Steve, was looking after Christopher and their own 15-month-old son, Martin. Later that night, after Steve had put Martin to bed and Chris was still happily watching the TV, he decided to go out to the local pub, the Crown, the pub where his wife worked. He was apparently just going for 1 pint, and as he left, he asked Christopher which crisps he wanted for when he returned. But this was the last time Chris would be seen alive by anyone who they felt knew him. Steve returned home about an hour later. His son was crying upstairs. The cord for the television set had been ripped out of the wall, and Chris was nowhere to be found. Police were notified and the search of the area was initiated and continued well into the next morning.
Christopher had never run away, and his mother had no idea where he was. His real father was contacted, but he hadn't seen Chris either. The search went on into the night. It was intensified at first light, fanning out across wasteland near Harpham Grove. But there was no sign of Christopher. Nor was there the ransom demand that was half expected. Christopher Laverack had now been missing for 36 hours. Expecting the worst, police divers began dragging a nearby stretch of water, but the discovery was not made by the police. At the same time, 10 miles away, alongside Beverly Beck, this man was taking his usual Sunday morning stroll with his dog. Christopher Laverack had died as a result of severe head injuries inflicted, the police believe, on Friday night.
A body had been wrapped in a carpet bag and then filled with bricks to weigh it down. It contained the body of a young boy, and it was later determined that it was Chris Laverack. This case aired on August the 16th, 1984, Crime Watch. The show referred to the case as the carpet bag murder. At approximately 9:15 p.m, a neighbour, whom Chris always called Auntie Marge, looked out of her window and saw an unfamiliar car with its headlights on in front of Steve and Kim's home. She also heard a man's voice saying, "Steve, Steve, I want to talk to you. Steve, let me in," coming from outside their front door. She put her ear to the dividing wall between the two houses and heard the front door opening, followed by a silence. A few minutes later, the car could be heard pulling away.
Then all seemed quiet, so she went off to bed. A few minutes later, she heard the car pulling away. That car, according to the best evidence police have, was shaped like this.
And Detective Chief Inspector Baker is in charge of that case. Now, that bag that Christopher was found in was actually a carpet bag.
Yes, it was a Treader underlay carpet bag. This is one identical to it.
And are you hoping that somebody might find that gone missing, maybe have lost it or left it?
Yes, hoping that somebody in the Humberside or Beverley area, sometime prior to the 9th of March, might have thrown one away or might have lent one to somebody or might have left one outside and it suddenly disappeared.
But it took officers 28 years to get enough evidence against their prime suspect. But who were they zeroing in on? Who was responsible for Christopher Laverack's abduction and subsequent murder? Well, their prime suspect was not a random person. It was someone who knew the family. It was apparently Christopher's lovable uncle, Melvin Reed, who posed in family pictures with the tragic youngster and even accompanied their relatives to identify his body. He was apparently the prime suspect from an early stage in the investigation. However, despite the suspicions of Melvin Reed, he was never charged. In 2001, several boys came forward to accuse Melvin Reed of touching them and attacking them. He was arrested and in 2003 locked up for 7.5 years for those offences. In the same year, police built up a case against Christopher's murderer. It was a man who should have protected him, his uncle, a man who knew that Christopher was there every Friday night, and maybe had been in the pub and seen Steve there, knowing maybe Christopher was on his own, or was it a random abduction? He'd come round to see Steve, and when he'd seen Christopher in the house on his own, abducted him. In 1984, Melvin Reed lived in Grantley Grove, just off Marfleet Lane in East Hull. It was only a 10-minute walk from Harpham Grove. He also owned a car that fitted the description of the vehicle that lady had seen in Harpham Grove on the night that Christopher disappeared. Melvin Reed did not have a meaningful alibi for the night in question, and he had knowledge of the site in Beverley where Christopher's body was found, having worked at a Beckside factory near the river. Now, following an interview with police in 2002, he was also shown to have lied about issues pivotal to the case. He had the means and the motive to commit this crime. However, a lack of hard evidence meant that officers were unable to charge him with his nephew's murder. Detective Inspector Conrad Owen, who started investigating Melvin Reed in 2001, said that all of Melvin Reed's offending against his victims was after Christopher Laverack's murder, which shows that Melvin Reed was seen as a dependable and trustworthy character. He succeeded in deceiving 4 sets of parents into thinking he was a lovable uncle, and he managed to pull that off until things started to fall apart in 2001. Then, one allegation came after another. 5 years later, Humberside police arrested Melvin Reed on suspicion of murdering Christopher Laverack after putting together circumstantial evidence that linked him to the killing. It was 22 years since Christopher's death, and police finally thought they had cracked the case. However, detectives still did not have enough forensic evidence for the Crown prosecution to charge him, meaning the family's wait for justice went on. But when Melvin Reed died in prison in 2008 while serving time for touching and attacking those young boys, it was that year that his identity was made public. Despite his death, Humberside police was still desperate to crack the cold case, and a team of 9 detectives was given the task of piecing together the forensic evidence needed to finally prove that Melvin Reed was Christopher Laverack's killer. Speaking in 2012, Detective Superintendent Ray Higgins said, "We had all the bad character evidence in terms of his propensity to offend, and we had a reasonable circumstantial case against him. What we needed was the forensic evidence, the glue that would hold it all together. We went through every single exhibit and article that had been recovered, and they were all looked at again for DNA or anything that could help. But Christopher's body had been dumped in the water and had been in there for a couple of days, so opportunities to harness DNA were diminished. It was a case of looking for another way. The crucial evidence was to come from a forensic paleontologist, Patricia Wiltshire, who had previously helped with another breakthrough of another case. She linked pollen found on the jeans and trainers of Christopher been wearing to Melvin Reed's garden in Grantley Grove. She also proved an ornamental brick used to weigh down the bag Christopher's body was found in had come from Reed's garden. The detectives were confident that this brick was used as part of the murder weapon. Her review, which concluded in 2011, involved analysing soil samples taken from Mr. Reed's garden during 2 excavations in 2002 and 2008. The detective superintendent said, "What we are looking for is a link between the brick found in the bag with the body and the suspect's garden, and whether there was the possibility of tracing pollen that might also link Christopher to Mr. Reed's garden. We gave her access to all of the samples we had recovered, including soil from sites across Hull. She came up with detailed findings. These showed conclusively that the brick had come from the address at Grantley Grove, Melvin's home, and Christopher's clothing had also been in contact with pollen from Melvin's garden. So this shows at one point he was clearly standing in Melvin's garden and then laid face down in the garden. We know at that point we had enough." After reviewing all the evidence, Detective Superintendent Higgins was able to put together a picture of the night Christopher was murdered. He discovered that Christopher had got to Grantley Grove where Reed lived, maybe in his car, before being sex attacked and then killed. A mark left on his body was similar to those suffered by Reed's other victims. Detective Superintendent Higgins added, "It seems something has happened that resulted in him being outside or in the back garden. We would say he had been murdered with this particular brick that was also found in the pond in the bag, which was then used to weigh the bag down. Reed probably took him to the beck that night." In 2012, Humberside Police categorically declared that Melvin Reed was the man who had murdered his nephew Christopher Laverack decades earlier. And after explaining the force's findings to Mrs. Crawley in 2012, Detective Superintendent Higgins said she was aware of Reed's sex offending and she understands this man was clearly the murderer. She knows his duplicity made him an expert in hiding his offending among the children. It was incredible he managed to keep it hidden for so long. Melvin Reed, however, took his dark secret to the grave as he died before police were able to arrest him for the murder of his nephew Christopher Laverack. It's a case that haunted detectives for almost 3 decades.